Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Mark Bollinger, and I'm a research scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And I am joined today by my colleague and co-author for this work, Joachim Seal. And together, Yo and I will walk you through highlights of our Utility Scale Solar 2021 edition report. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website later today or tomorrow. We expect the presentation portion of the webinar to last about 45 minutes, which should leave a fair amount of time for questions and hopefully some answers as well. So if you do have questions, please type them into the Q&A portion or feature on your Zoom Zoom toolbar. And we will do our best to try and answer those with the time we have left at the end. Okay, just a little background on this report. We've been doing this report for 9 years now, and its purpose is really to summarize data, most of which is publicly available, on key trends in the U.S. utility scale solar sector. We define utility scale to include any ground-mounted projects that's larger than 5 megawatts of AC capacity. So if you're interested in smaller projects, we're not going to have much content for you here today. We do have a separate effort that focuses on smaller ground-mounted projects as well as roof-mounted PV projects, and that's called Tracking the Sun, and you can find all of that material at trackingthesun.lbl.gov. This work is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy's Solar Energy Technologies Office, and we appreciate their support as always. And then I guess the final thing I want to note here is you can find this deck as well as an accompanying Excel data file that contains the underlying data for just about every graphic that you'll see today. There's also a written technical brief as well as a few interactive data visualizations, and all of that content is available at utilityscalesolar.lbl.gov. So we have a lot of material to cover today. This report tends to go from the nose to tail of the utility scale sector, really trying to cover really the whole spectrum of things that one might look at. So Yo and I are going to split this up. Yo will start out talking about deployment and technology trends and also upfront capital costs or CapEx. He'll then turn it back to me to focus on performance, which we view through the lens of capacity factor. And I'll also talk about then the levelized cost of energy as well as PPA prices for these utility scale PV projects. Then Yo will take on explaining wholesale market value and trends in that for utility scale PV plants. I'll talk a little bit about this trend towards hybridization and some of the data we've collected on PV plus battery plants. We'll skip the concentrating solar thermal power or CSP section, given that there hasn't been a whole lot of market activity in that realm in recent years. And then finally, we'll take a bit of an outlook to see what's in the pipeline via the interconnection queues. And then, as I mentioned, we should have some time at the end for questions as well. Before I hand it off to Yo, I just wanted to kind of quickly define the regions that we're looking at whenever you see a slide that has regional analysis on it. So in a nutshell, we conform to the footprints of these 7 different independent system operators or ISOs that operate wholesale markets throughout the US. And then we have these 2 additional regions where ISOs don't exist. So we have this non-ISO West region, which tends to be pretty large, as well as the non-ISO Southeast. And then of course, there's Hawaii as well. So we have 10 regions in all. And we just wanted to get that out of the way up front so that you know what we're referring to whenever we show a slide with regional analysis. So with that, let me hand it over to Yo to talk about deployment and technology trends.
Thank you, Mark, and a warm welcome from me as well. Again, if you just joined us, if you have questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to post those in the Q&A box in the Zoom interface. In this first section, I'll present some of the overarching deployment and technology trends to provide you just with a little bit of background for the later discussions. Next slide, please, Mark. Thanks. Before diving into the details, let's start out with high-level introduction. 2020 was really a record-breaking year for solar. And I think this is quite a feat given that the COVID-19 pandemic changed many of our routines. SEA estimates with Wood Mackenzie that nearly 20 gigawatts DC of solar was installed in 2020. In contrast to some analyses from past years, they do not believe this to be a temporary ITC-related explosion anymore, but rather a new normal of 20 plus gigawatts annual growth rates for the years to come. The utility scale sector is really the underlying driver of this growth, installing most of the PV modules. Nearly 3/4 of the 2020 solar capacity was built by the utility scale sector alone. And of all that large scale solar capacity that exists in the United States, more than 1/4 was just installed in the last year. The analysis that we present today focuses on a subset of this large-scale solar sample on projects that are larger than 5 megawatts AC. Our sample for the year 2020 is the largest ever that we had, comprised of 161 new projects that were completed in the last year, and that account for nearly 13 gigawatts DC or nearly 10 gigawatts AC. Next slide, please. Here we compare how solar's growth stacks up against other generator sources. Large-scale solar is in orange, distributed solar is in yellow, wind is in blue, and natural gas is in brown. Since 2014, no new coal has been built anymore. And while the United States still builds new natural gas power plants, they account for only 20% of the new capacity in 2020. The majority now really comes from either wind or solar, each contributing about 40% of the new capacity. Next slide, please. But the solar capacity is not uniformly spread across the United States or its loads. And compared to the entire electric system as it exists, solar still only makes up about 3 or 4% of all the electrons running through the grid. So solar's impressive growth rate is about to change these numbers, but so far the share is really modest on a national level at least. How much electricity comes from solar depends a bit by how you slice the statistics, either as percentage of in-state generation or in-state load, whether you look at the contribution of photovoltaics alone, as shown on the map, or if one also includes concentrating solar power, as shown on the table. Regardless, California has more than 20% of its electric generation coming from solar, by far the most. 4 other states surpass 10% by this metric, the northeastern Massachusetts and Vermont, but also Hawaii and Nevada. And if we look instead at penetration by load, the southwestern states like Arizona and Utah become more prominent. You can explore these and many other of our statistics and trends yourself in interactive visualizations that are posted on our project website. Next slide, please. This map shows all the new large-scale solar additions in the United States in the year 2020 alone. As we don't have cumulative installations pictured on this map, you don't see all the little dots of projects coming online over the past years in the 44 states that have now utility-scale solar installations. There are a few projects that I want to draw your attention to specifically. Texas added not only the most solar capacity in 2020, but it also installed one of the largest projects that we've seen so far, the 410 megawatt AC Roadrunner project in Western Texas that uses bifacial modules mounted on single axis trackers. Nearly all new projects now use that single-axis tracking technology, unless the ground is particularly challenging, for example, landfills or hard rock, or because of really high potential wind loads, as we see them in Florida. Those fixed load projects are shown in little circles on the map. But even projects in high latitude states like Wisconsin, Michigan, or New York now use tracking projects, as shown by the little diamonds on the map. 2020 also saw a few more large-scale solar and storage hybrids, though as we discuss later, these projects still only make up a small minority of the existing solar projects. 4 smaller projects, hybrids, were built in the Northeast, while Hawaii and California added 2 larger PV battery systems. Next slide, please. I already touched upon this briefly, but the regional makeup of solar is really beginning to change significantly. For the rest of this presentation, we will now switch from statistics by state and focus instead on regions that have more meaning from a grid perspective. ERCOT, the electrical grid in Texas, surpassed CAISO of California as the leader of new utility scale installations in 2020, adding 1/4 of all the new capacity. The Southeast has, as a broad region, has built a lot of solar too over the past 5 years, but especially Florida, Georgia, and Virginia. However, California still has the most solar installed on a cumulative basis. Next slide, please. We already saw this as a 2020 snapshot on the map, but single-axis tracking has really dominated solar additions over the past 6 years. This was especially true in 2020, when 9 out of 10 modules were mounted on trackers that followed the sun over the course of the days, resulting in higher annual output compared to a fixed tilt system. As we will see in a bit, the cost premium for trackers has fallen over the past years, such that the overall economics are now really in favor of this tracking technology in most of the United States. Next slide, please. We measure the strength of a solar resource in kilowatt hours per square meters a day, a metric that is known as global horizontal irradiance, or GHI. Looking at the median GHI across all projects, we can see that the early installations in the Southwest had really the most amount of sunshine, and that GHI declined as solar developments expanded into other regions of the United States. Since 2017, that average solar resource has, however, stabilized again. All else equal, this build-out of lower irradiance sites dampens the average performance across all the system in our sample, as we'll discuss later. Next slide, please. As module prices have come down over the years, we have seen a slow trend to increase the array module DC capacity relative to the inverter AC capacity. The ratio of the two is called the inverter loading ratio, or ILR. A higher ILR can increase the utilization factor of the inverter and can reduce output variability. In 2020, the DC module capacity was on average about 35% larger than the inverter AC capacity. Again, all else equal, this trend will boost the average project performance that we'll discuss later. It is also the reason why we sometimes distinguish between statistics in this presentation that are either denominated in watt DC or watt AC. Next slide, Mark. I'll now briefly share with you our new research findings of upfront capital costs of utility scale solar. To compare apples with apples, we're excluding any potential battery cost adders among the hybrid projects from the next few statistics. And because of time limits, I will not discuss operation and maintenance costs, but you can find that information in the briefing deck and the data sheets that we have posted online. Next slide, please. It is not necessarily easy getting reliable cost information on a project level. We rely on confidential developer interviews, public regulatory filings, and press statements. And we've gathered cost information for nearly 70 projects that came online in 2020, representing nearly 2/3 of all the new capacity that was built in the year 2020. For earlier years, we're partnering with the EIA to get confidential project level cost information for nearly all the projects that were built until the end of 2018. As you can see, the median installed costs of PV have fallen continuously by about 12% a year, or nearly 75% since 2010, to $1.42 a watt AC or $1.05 a watt DC in the year 2020. While there's still a bit of a price spread among projects, really expensive outliers above $2 a watt have really become less common. Large cost adders due to the COVID-19 pandemic have also not materialized in our sample, at least when we compare it to historical costs. The cheapest 20% of all the projects that came online in 2020 cost about $1.10 a watt AC or 90 cents a watt DC. In our 2020 sample, projects that use trackers exhibit a small upfront cost premium over fixed tilt plants of about 20 cents a watt or so. But this can be compensated by increased generation. Of course, the sample here is backwards looking and does not reflect the cost of new projects that are built in 2021 or 2022, which may be cheaper or maybe a bit expensive as well, depending what the COVID supply chain troubles may give us over the next years. Next slide, please. On this slide, we only focus on 2020 installations and examine how project costs vary by size. We can see that even within the utility scale sector, there appear to be economies of scale. Projects that range between 50 and 100 megawatts are nearly 30 cents cheaper than projects ranging between 20 and 50 megawatts. This trend is even a little bit more obvious when we look at costs in DC terms, as prices decline from $1.23 to 95 cents a watt among the larger size categories. I'll now hand it back to Mark, who will discuss how these projects actually perform.
All right, thank you, Yo. I received a message that my audio is potentially a little garbled. I'm not exactly sure if I can do anything about that, so hopefully that problem will not persist and you'll be able to hear me clearly. So yes, as Yo mentioned, we do evaluate the performance of these projects via what's known as a capacity factor. And for those of you not familiar with the term capacity factor, it's simply a measure of how much energy a plant generates within a given period of time. We tend to look at full years relative to how much energy it could have generated over that same full year time period if it had been operating at full capacity at all times. So for our sample of, in this case, 752 projects totaling 28.6 gigawatts that came online through 2019, you can see here that capacity factors range from as low as 9% up to 36% on an AC basis, with the median residing around 24%. So there's quite a bit of variability, and a fair amount of that variability can be explained by the three drivers that we've broken out in this graph here. So at the very first level down at the bottom, we split up the sample into quartiles depending on how strong the solar resource is at each site. We then further split it up into those projects where the modules are mounted at a fixed tilt versus tracking the sun throughout the day. And then finally, we also break it up into quartiles depending on the DC to AC ratio or inverter loading ratio, also known as ILR of the plant. And as you can see, as you go from left to right, you basically get this ascending picture here, which makes intuitive sense. There are still some outliers like this one you see here, and some of that could be due to curtailment in some cases, or it may just reflect plants underperforming. For those of you who would prefer to think in regional terms rather than in terms of solar resource or global horizontal irradiance, This graph breaks out the same data by region and also by fixed tilt versus tracking plants. Not surprisingly, you see the highest capacity factors over here on the right in California and in the Western US, where the sun is strongest, and the lowest capacity factors in the Northeast. You may also notice that tracking tends to boost performance more in these high insolation regions than it does in the less sunny parts of the country. And as a result, we see a greater proportion of plants using single axis tracking in these sunnier regions. This graph here tracks capacity factor by project vintage. And so you can see that from between 2010 and 2013, the average capacity factor of a utility scale PV plant built over those 4 years increased from about 20% up to 25%. And that is a result of these same three drivers that I already talked about and that are also reflected on this graph. So we saw an increase in tracking. We saw sunnier sites being developed, and the DC to AC ratio also increased pretty significantly over this period. Since 2013, though, the fleet-wide capacity factor, not the fleet-wide, the capacity factor by project vintage has kind of stagnated and even declined a bit in recent years. And that again can largely be explained by these three drivers. We've seen the prevalence of tracking continue to pick up, but at the same time, we've seen the industry expand into less sunny parts of the country, as denoted by this green line here showing the average built solar resource over this period. Meanwhile, the DC to AC ratio has more or less trended sideways right around 1.3 over this period. And even though this trend towards lower irradiance sites has a negative impact on capacity factor, it is nevertheless certainly a positive trend for the industry in the sense that it indicates that solar can compete even in less sunny parts of the country. And then the final thing I'll show here on performance is that we also track how performance declines as these projects age. And so you can see from the graph here that based on our sample, we're seeing roughly a 1.2% per year performance decline or declining capacity factor as projects age. And that's probably a higher number than you're used to seeing. Typically, I think one thinks of degradation being somewhere in the 0.5 to 0.7% per year range. But I do want to emphasize really two things here. One, we're looking at total plant level degradation here. We're not focusing just on module degradation. And I guess the second thing to note is that we're including both recoverable and unrecoverable degradation. So a lot of studies that look at this kind of thing try to filter out degradation that is considered recoverable through, for example, more stringent O&M protocols. Unfortunately, our data, the resolution of our data is really not good enough to enable us to filter out those sorts of things. So this 1.2% number really represents sort of an aggregate all-in plant level degradation number. Right now, I'm going to move on to the levelized cost of energy and power purchase agreement prices. So Yo talked about the decline in upfront capital costs, and I just ran through some trends in capacity factor where we've seen an increase at least through 2013. What we didn't show is that operating expenses have also been declining. Design life has been improving, as well as and financing terms have also improved as well. And all of those things working together have really driven the LCOE of solar lower since 2010 by about 85%, or roughly 17% annually on average, to $34 per megawatt hour in 2020. And that number does not include the effect of the investment tax credit. The bubbles here represent individual plant capacities. And one thing you might notice here is what appears like it could be economies of scale, in the sense that we see the larger bubbles trending towards lower LCOEs in most cases, whereas the outliers on the high side all tend to be pretty small projects. Here we see the exact same data that I just showed you, but in this case, portrayed a little bit differently. Instead of the plant level bubbles, here we've aggregated those plants up to the regional level, with each region having its own line here. And really, the point I wanted to convey on this graph is simply that the sort of the spread of LCOE across regions has really narrowed over time with some degree of convergence here. Back in the early days of the industry, you would expect a Western PPA price to be, or Western LCOE to be much lower than you'd see in the East. That is no longer necessarily the case. I mean, there's still a difference, obviously, but the spread has really narrowed as the upfront cost of these plants has declined. Turning now to PPA prices, as you might expect, we've seen PPA prices follow LCOE lower in pretty much every single region that we looked at, though the pace of decline has stagnated somewhat in recent years. So the graph on the left shows our full PPA sample, which amounts to almost 23 gigawatts. And the graph on the right, we're focusing just on the recent years to make things a little bit more legible. And what you do see here in the graph on the right is, kind of sideways movement over the last few years, which is perhaps to be expected once PPA prices get down to the levels where they are now, which is around $20 per megawatt hour in the West. Those are the red circles that you see here. I guess want to just add that here we're looking only at PV only projects. We're not including hybrid projects here. We do track hybrid PPA prices, and I'll get to those a little bit later. All right, this graph shows the same PPA price data, but again, presented a little bit differently. The tan bars here represent the nationwide average over time. Each line represents sort of the regional average over time as well. And what you see here is, a similar trend in LCOE, roughly 85% decline since 2009. That's about 15% per year on average. But once again, the pace of decline has slowed. And in fact, we see a little bit of an uptick in recent years, which is consistent with, some of the other folks who track PPA prices like Level 10. I think they've been showing an increase as well over this period. Okay, we track not only solar PPA prices, but also wind PPA prices. And the graph on the upper left brings those two together on the same axes in order to make them more comparable. And what you see is that even though at one point these two markets were fairly different in terms of prices, there has been a convergence to the point where over the last few years, wind and PPA prices are very similar depending on where you are in the country. These black dashes represent the levelized gas price projections from the Energy Information Administration at each specific point in time. And really the point of including those in this graph is simply to demonstrate that wind and solar PPA prices are currently pretty competitive with even just the cost of burning natural gas in existing combined cycle generators. So in other words, not even considering the upfront capital cost to build those gas-fired generators, wind and solar can still pretty much compete with fuel prices. The graph on the right shows a similar story, but in a different way. So here we're not looking at levelized PPA prices, but instead we're looking at prices, what the prices will be going out over time from a sample of recent contracts. And those are shown in green, whereas the blue shows the most recent gas price forecast from the Energy Information Administration. And what you see here is that even though solar PPAs are priced a little bit higher at present, because most solar PPAs are flat priced in nominal dollars, the price actually declines in real dollar terms over time. And as a result, you see solar becoming more competitive with fuel prices over time. It's also important to note that these solar PPA prices are locked in contractually, whereas the fuel price projections are highly uncertain, which is denoted by kind of the widening cone or range around the reference case fuel cost projection. So in that sense, this graph also nicely illustrates the hedge value that solar can provide as a fuel price hedge. All right, the final thing we can do here with PPA prices and LCOE is to kind of plot them together. And once again, as I mentioned earlier, these two do seem to track each other pretty well. And since 2016, at least, you can see that the PPA price has been tracking very closely with the LCOE curve that includes the effect of the ITC. And this suggests that this credit, this investment tax credit, is in fact being passed through to off-takers in the form of lower PPA prices, which in turn is a sign of a competitive market that's efficient and is more cost-based than value-based. And that's all, those are all positive attributes. So with that, let me turn it back to Yo to talk about wholesale market value.
Thanks, Mark. And again, a quick reminder that if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A box. I've tried to address a couple while Mark was speaking, but I've left a couple for later discussion as well. So if you have any questions, just put them in. In this section, we'll now analyze the historical market value of solar generation within the 7 organized wholesale power markets managed by the ISOs across the United States. And then we'll also use a similar but somewhat less granular approach to estimate the value of solar for 10 non-ISO utilities. Next slide, please. Our analysis focuses on the location-specific marginal energy and capacity values of solar that are then averaged across the residential, commercial, and utility scale sectors. To do that, we have developed plant-level hourly generation estimates that are based on project-specific technical characteristics and also historical irradiance records. We then debias those estimated generation profiles using both ISO-wide hourly solar records and plant-level monthly records. For distributed solar, we developed county-level profiles as well. In terms of methods, in the organized wholesale markets, the solar energy value represents simply the product of real-time energy prices at the nearest wholesale market node and the coincident solar generation of a given plant. Solar's capacity value represents the contribution of solar to meeting resource adequacy requirements, and it is determined by a project's capacity credit and the coincident capacity prices. This capacity value can be a little harder to monetize for solar project owners because of additional performance requirements or other market restrictions. Solar's total value, or total market value as we discuss it here today, is then simply the sum of its energy and capacity values, expressed on a pre-curtailment basis where curtailment data is available. We thus exclude from this presentation other potential revenue streams that an owner might be able to monetize. For example, the value of providing ancillary services, renewable energy credit value, savings from avoided transmission demand charges, or other externalities that are not included currently in wholesale prices, such as, for example, a carbon mitigation value. So our market value can be thought of as representing the revenue earned by a merchant solar plant from selling power into organized spot markets. Next slide, please. I don't see the new slide yet. There it is. Here we show the variation in solar value from utility scale plants on the left and from distributed solar on the right for the year 2020. The color of the bubbles or squares indicate the combined energy and capacity value, while the size of the marker indicates the capacity size of a given project. You can see how values vary between regions. For example, they're rather low in CAISO and MISO, but high in the center of the country in SPP or in FPL in Florida. But they also vary within regions. Some project level value variation is based on generation profiles, but they also vary because of locational energy and capacity prices. Transmission constraints and associated price volatility can also play a large role here. If you are interested, you can go to an interactive data visualization on our project website and explore all of these estimates in much more detail. And you can actually also download a lot of the underlying data there. Next slide, please. We will now roll up these previous plant and county-specific results into broader regional averages. The energy value is depicted here in blue, and it's the dominant value component in most regions. From 2012 through 2020, the annual energy value of solar varied mostly in concert with wholesale energy prices. The main driver of that wholesale price decline, as you probably know, since 2014, were decreasing natural gas prices. The capacity value is shown in red in this graph. Solar's capacity value has a broad range, both between regions, but also over years within a region. For example, in CAISO, that capacity value has really declined from the early years. Summing up that energy and capacity value for solar, the total value used to range from $40 to $80 a megawatt hours in most markets in the early years of 2012, 2014, but it declined thereafter. In 2020, the total market value ranged from the mid $20 per megawatt hour in ERCOT, MISO, and CAISO, up to $50 a megawatt hour in SPP, really driven there primarily by very high capacity values. While solar's market value has declined over time, the falling PPA prices that Mark presented have largely kept pace, thus more or less maintaining solar's competitiveness. In some regions like SPP and the broader non-ISO West, solar's 2020 energy and capacity value actually exceeded that of a levelized PPA price of contracts signed in that same region in the same year. An off-taker who purchased solar power then through a PPA paid less than what they otherwise would have had to pay when purchasing the same amount of energy and capacity from the wholesale spot market in that region. As Mark said, in 2020, prices for newly signed PPAs have actually increased in a few markets by a little bit for the first time in a while. Whether or not this trend will continue and whether it will pose a problem in an environment in which solar influences wholesale markets and thus its own value more decisively, I think remains to be seen. Next slide, please. To provide a sense of whether solar provided above or below average value relative to other market participants, one can compare solar's value with that value of an average energy capacity price. The latter then represents a generator that operates at full capacity in all hours of the year, and we call that a flat block of power. The ratio of solar's value and the value of a flat block of power is the solar value factor. It indicates whether solar's value is above or below the average market value, so above or below 100%. This value factor normalizes changes in value that are due to broader trends over time and focuses specifically on the alignment of the solar profile with times of high wholesale power prices. It's quite useful to analyze the effects of increasing solar penetration, that is shown here in circles, or solar value. At higher penetration levels, so kind of on the left side here on this graph, solar's marginal operating costs are near $0 per megawatt hour can push wholesale prices to below where they would have been absent of solar. Solar's marginal capacity credit also declines as the peak net load then shifts increasingly into the late afternoon and early evening hours. So solar's value factor in CAISO was 140% in 2012, so 40% more valuable than a flat block of power, when penetration was just 2%, but it fell to 70% in 2020, or 30% below an average flat block of power at a penetration of 21%. Similar trends exist in Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico. For most ISOs and balancing areas, however, solar's market value really clusters still at high levels, indicating the robust value that solar can provide due to its alignment with higher than average energy prices, especially at lower penetration levels. Next slide, please. To better understand the origin of the value differences between solar generation and a flat block of power, we can differentiate between the effects of location, curtailment, and profile. We again use the concept of a flat block of the flat block value as our starting point. Those are the black numbers at the bottom of the graph on the right side, and that shows how they vary by ISO. We start by depicting the relative difference between the flat block of power at all price nodes in an ISO and those that are located close to a solar project in green. Overall, this has a pretty limited effect with the exception of ERCOT, so Texas, and MISO. In a second step, we then compare the value differences at those solar locations that are driven just by solar's generation profile, and that is shown in gold. And as you can see, this is really the dominant effect and can either be negative, as it's the case in CAISO, in ERCOT in the year 2020, and in ISO New England. But it can also be highly positive, as it's the case in PJM and SPP. In 2019, by the way, this effect was really positive in ERCOT when we had so much scarcity pricing with really high energy prices, and solar was able to capture that. Finally, we adjust solar's value downward for reported curtailment in CAISO and ERCOT, and that is shown in dark blue here. Next slide, please. So I'll now hand it back to Mark, who will describe how some developers intend to address this value decline that solar faces at higher penetrations, coupled by coupling solar with storage.
Okay, thanks, Gio. Yes, so as Gio mentioned, one way to potentially mitigate solar's value decline is to add a battery, and that has become a pretty popular thing to do, as I'm sure most of you are aware. Within our public data file that I mentioned earlier, we do have one tab there that tracks metadata on, I believe it's more than 150 different PV plus battery hybrid plants that have either been built or are in the pipeline and have secured an offtake arrangement. So actually not that many of them have been built. More of them are still under development, but there is a lot of good information in that table. We're not going to run through that table, but we will now talk a little bit about some of the underlying data that we've pulled out of some of those particular plants. Starting with upfront capital costs. So here we are looking at plants that are just only those plants that are online. And what the graph shows is the incremental cost of adding a battery to your PV plant denominated in dollar per watt AC terms, where the wattage pertains to the PV plant. And the size of the bubble represents the storage duration. So these plants range from 1 to 4 hours of storage duration. And you can see that the incremental cost adder of adding a battery really sort of increases linearly with both the size of the battery and the duration of the battery. So for example, if you were to add, let's say, a 4-hour battery sized at parity with your PV plant, at least historically, that might have added another $2 per watt onto the cost of your project. As I mentioned earlier, we also track PPA prices for these PV plus battery hybrid plants where we can. And so these three graphs show levelized PPA prices from a sample of 47 PPAs. All three graphs show the same data, with the only difference being what the size of the bubbles represent. So in the upper left, the size of the bubbles correspond to battery capacity. In the upper right, we're looking at PV capacity. And then down in the bottom right, we're looking at the battery to PV capacity ratio. And I'm just going to focus on the graph in the bottom right and draw out sort of 2 or 3 takeaways here. So the first thing you'll notice, of course, is that Hawaii is priced at a pretty significant premium to the lower 48 states. And that could, of course, reflect the fact that Hawaii is a remote island community where things obviously cost a little bit more than they do here on the mainland. But it might also reflect the fact that virtually all of these plants have a battery that is sized at parity to the PV capacity. So we're looking at 100% storage to generator ratios here, really across the board in Hawaii. And as we just saw, the larger the battery, the higher the cost. And so that's going to get passed through in a higher PPA price. Second thing to note here is that these hybrid PPA prices have declined seemingly over time. Whereas on the mainland, that decline has been much more gradual. And again, this could potentially be attributable to this battery to PV capacity ratio. So whereas in Hawaii, it's been fixed at 100% over time, taking that variable out of the equation. In the lower 48, we've seen this trend towards larger batteries over time. You can see smaller circles on the left and larger circles over on the right. And obviously, as your battery size increases, that's going to bump up your costs a bit, thereby muting the otherwise declining trend in PPA prices that you might see. A subset of the PPAs for which we have pricing actually break out the battery pricing from the PV pricing. And that enables us to calculate what I'll call levelized storage adder, which simply tells you the dollar per megawatt hour addition or increase in your PPA price due to having the battery there as well. And just to be clear, we're expressing this in dollars per megawatt hour PV, not dollar per megawatt hour stored. Those are two different things. So you can see in the upper left here that adding a battery increases your PPA price from anywhere from, or by anywhere from maybe $5 per megawatt hour if you have a relatively small battery, up to maybe $20 per megawatt hour if you size the battery at parity with the PV plant. The graph in the upper right attempts to tease a time trend out of the data here by binning all of the different adders into three different size buckets. And if you kind of squint at this graph, you might be able to discern a bit of a decline over time, although I think it's probably more sideways than anything. But one thing you can see here definitely is, again, this trend towards larger batteries. So, the earliest projects or the earliest PPAs in our sample here fall into this lowest size bin, whereas the most recent fall into the higher or highest size bin. All right, so now we're going to close out with a look forward at what's coming through the pipeline in terms of capacity within generator interconnection queues across the country. So this graph shows the amount of capacity working its way through 42 different interconnection queues across the US, which in aggregate cover about 85% of total US load. So it's a pretty comprehensive coverage of what's going on in the US. And the first thing you'll notice here is that solar really dominates the queues. Solar has really been the only thing that's been increasing in the queues over the last few years, other than storage. Both wind and natural gas have been declining in recent years. And just the sheer amount of solar really dwarfs anything else that we're seeing right now. At the end of 2020, there were 460 gigawatts of solar in the queues. And these hatched portions of the columns show the amount of that capacity that is paired with a battery. So in the case of solar, roughly 34% of the capacity in the queues at the end of 2020 is paired with a battery. And that amounts to 160 gigawatts of PV in hybrid form. That's much more than wind, where we see just a little bit of wind capacity paired with battery. So let me move on. This slide shows really the same sort of graph, the same format of graph, but in this case, we're focusing solely on the solar capacity and looking at it across different regions. And there are a few things I want to point out here. The first being that The distribution of solar across the US is pretty widespread. You might think of solar as being something for California, the Southwest, or the Southeast, but that's clearly not the case. PJM is the leading region in terms of solar capacity coming through the queues, and there is a pretty good spread across the U.S., with the perhaps notable exception of the Northeast. Second thing to note is just the amount of solar capacity in California that is in hybrid form. Nearly 90% of all capacity in CAISO's queue as of the end of 2020 included a battery. And in the non-ISO West region, it was also a high percentage. It was 67%. And that's really a reflection of the higher market penetration of solar in both of those regions. So really, three themes I think here that come out of the queue data. One being the dominance of solar, two being sort of the widespread distribution of solar throughout the US. It seems to spread more and more every year. And the third being this notable trend towards hybridization. So with that, we took a little bit more time than we had thought, but we still have a few minutes for questions. Yo, have you been monitoring the questions some, and would you like to read one or two off here?
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Mark. There are a couple of questions around the inverter loading ratio and DC and AC sizing, and kind of how one thinks about it and whether there's like one optimal value or not. I think in general, the answer is highly site specific. So a fixed tilt project, historically at least, used to have a little bit of a higher DC to AC ratio. So again, putting more modules on racks than what the inverter would actually be capable of transferring into AC electricity. And that's just because, well, it's not following the course of the sun over the day. And just having more modules enables you to capture a little bit more of that sunshine. So tracking projects used to have a little bit of a lower ILR. If you are in more northern latitudes where you have less solar radiance, you can again add more modules and thus have a higher ILR that may be cost effective for you. If you have a battery and that is DC coupled, so before you have the electricity going through the inverter, you again can increase really the ILR to 60, 70, 80%, and store some of that electricity before it is sent to the inverter. So I don't really think that there's one specific number that is optimal for all conditions. It kind of depends what you want to do with that electricity and when you want to sell it into markets or deliver it. Similarly, there was a question, how does this then manifest in price differences? Well, if you express it in DC watt terms, and your DC wattage is bigger because you have more modules relative to the inverter capacity, then the denominator is larger, and so the resulting price is a little lower. If you express it in AC terms, and you have a fixed inverter but add more and more modules, your price is going to increase, and while your denominator is not growing with that, and so that then yields higher dollars per watt AC cost numbers.
Okay, great. Thanks, Yo. While you were talking, I caught up on these a little bit. There is one question someone asked about the historical conversion rate from what's in the queue to what actually is built. And we don't have like perfect numbers on this, but we have looked into it a little bit. And the conversion rate tends to be around, I believe something like 25%. So, it's a good point that what's in the queue is only kind of a rough indication of what might come to be, but it is nevertheless, one of the best sources of data that we have to kind of at least get a sneak peek into developer interest in various markets.
Cool, thanks, Mark. There was one question about whether or not we include carbon mitigation value and that is a critical value component. I agree. We have similar analyses that we do for the wind tech market for the Department of Energy. And there we have included, for example, already carbon mitigation value. Going forward, next year, we may also include a carbon mitigation value for solar. How you quantify that, of course, depends on a lot of assumptions and what you believe the social cost of carbon to be or carbon prices to be. So, stay tuned for that as we think about this a little bit more.
Okay, and I'll take another one. Someone asked about the seeming disconnect between increasing PPA prices in recent years or year and declining LCOE in those same years. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're looking at LCOE based on commercial operation date, whereas in most cases we're looking at PPA prices based on the date that the contract was signed. So you might sign a PPA today for a project that won't come online until 2023 or maybe 2024. And so PPA prices tend to be a little bit more forward-looking in that respect. And so I think maybe the increase that we're seeing today is probably a function of a few things. One being the scheduled phase out of the investment tax credit. And again, if that tax credit is being passed through in PPA prices, as we think it is, then as it phases down, all else equal, the PPA price will have to increase somewhat. So that's one thing. And then, of course, we've all heard about the supply chain challenges that appear to be ongoing, and also just the general increase in commodity costs and natural gas prices, things like that. I think all of these things are kind of conspiring to push PPA prices a little bit higher, even though we see LCOE declining through 2020 based on prices that were kind of locked in a few years ago.
Thanks, Mark. There was one question about global horizontal irradiance or irradiance and specific yield. So specific yield, I believe, is a metric that describes kilowatt hours produced by kilowatt peak or kilowatt DC. So it's basically just like a metric conversion where you need to put the kilowatt hours per square meter per day into an annual term, and then look at the module efficiency, how much wattage you have per square meter, and then you can transfer those two. But yes, they are directly related.
Okay, I'll take another one. Someone asked whether the degradation measure that I showed, the 1.2% per year performance decline rate, includes project downtime, and the answer is yes, it does. As I was trying to explain, we don't have high enough resolution data to really filter out downtime events. So yeah, it's definitely an imperfect measure that might be considered sort of all inclusive of everything that could possibly go wrong to your plant.
There was one comment that as solar penetration increases and solar's value may decline unless it is coupled, for example, with storage, or demand flexibility really shifts how demand manifests in also markets, that PPA buyers who sign contracts now experience a big reduction in values after contract signing. And I think it gets a little bit at a thorny issue, and one needs to distinguish here between a marginal value of new project that is being built and the average value of a solar project. Of course, PPAs that were signed back in 2010 for $200 a megawatt hour are much more expensive than what it is worth now to buy solar electricity on the spot market in CAISO. But at the same time, you have a certain hedge value, and where you have certain guarantees for a 20-year period, including inflation, and those early, somewhat expensive solar projects still brought down the overall price for other projects for years to come and for consumers. So I think it depends really on the average versus marginal discussion here.
Okay, and with that, it looks like we are at the top of the hour. So if we didn't get to your question, we apologize. I think in most cases we do have your contact info, so we can try to get back to you via email. So thanks again, everyone, for attending, and thanks to the U.S. Department of Energy for funding this work. And have a great rest of your day. The webinar will be posted to our website within a day or two. Thanks very much.
Thank you.